"Security, remove him." The words sliced through the music like a blade across glass. The laughter on the yacht didn't fade gradually. It stopped. 1 second, there was jazz floating over the water, the soft hum of conversations, champagne flutes clinking under warm Miami lights. The next second, the entire upper deck fell into a stunned silence. 50 guests turned their heads at once. The Atlantic stretched dark and endless beyond the polished railings, and the massive white yacht rocked gently under the glow of string lights and the distant skyline. In the center of the deck stood a man who looked like he had walked into the wrong party. At least that's what everyone assumed. Darnell Williams stood calmly near the entrance ramp, one hand resting loosely at his side, the other holding a simple glass of sparkling water he hadn't even taken a sip from yet. No designer suit, no entourage, just a clean white linen shirt, sleeves rolled halfway up his forearms, dark trousers, and quiet confidence that somehow made the tension around him even sharper. The hostess, a tall blonde woman with a clipboard tucked under her arm, had positioned herself squarely between him and the rest of the deck like a gatekeeper protecting a palace. Her smile had disappeared the moment she looked him up and down. "I already told you," she said louder this time, making sure the nearby guests heard every word. "This event is private." A few people shifted uncomfortably, glancing between the two of them. Others leaned closer, sensing the drama unfolding like a live show they hadn't expected when they stepped aboard the luxury vessel an hour earlier. The yacht itself was a floating symbol of wealth. Nearly 160 feet long, polished teak decks, glowing bars, and a skyline view that made every guest feel like they were standing at the center of the city's power circle. This was supposed to be one of Miami's most exclusive maritime networking events of the summer. CEOs, investors, venture capitalists, yacht brokers. The kind of party where invitations mattered more than money. Which is exactly why the hostess's voice carried a certain authority when she spoke again. "You're not on the list." She tapped the clipboard as if that settled the matter. A man in a navy blazer nearby chuckled under his breath. Someone else whispered, "How did he even get past?" The dock. The security guard near the stairway shifted his stance, waiting for instructions. But the man in the linen shirt didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. Darnell Williams simply stood there, steady as the tide rolling beneath the yacht's hull, his eyes moving slowly across the deck, as if he were observing something much larger than the moment itself. The hostess mistook that silence for hesitation. "Sir," she said again, this time sharper, "this yacht party is invitation only. If you're not listed, you need to leave." The city lights shimmered across the water behind him. The ocean breeze lifted the edge of his shirt. And still he didn't move. Not toward the exit. Not toward the crowd. Just one calm breath, like a man who had seen this scene play out before. Because the truth none of them knew yet, the truth hidden beneath the linen shirt, beneath the quiet composure, was that Darnell Williams wasn't some stranger who slipped past the marina gates. He wasn't lost. He wasn't confused. And he definitely didn't arrive by accident. But the moment that would make the entire yacht realize that hadn't come yet. Darnell Williams did not rush to explain himself, and he did not try to impress anyone on the deck because the truth was that he had walked onto this yacht exactly the way he intended to, quietly, without attention, without the symbols of wealth that people expected to see on men who belonged in places like this, and that decision had been deliberate from the moment he stepped out of the Blacktown car at the marina 20 minutes earlier, because Darnell Williams had spent more than 2 decades learning how people treated power when it was visible and how differently they treated it when it was hidden, and tonight he wanted to see the difference again with his own eyes. The hostess, however, did not see a billionaire. She saw a man in rolled sleeves and simple shoes standing on a 160-foot luxury yacht where every other guest looked like they had stepped out of a financial magazine, the men in tailored jackets, the women in elegant evening dresses, the glow of the Miami skyline reflecting across the water while servers carried trays of champagne between clusters of investors laughing about shipping contracts and venture deals. This was supposed to be a celebration of maritime innovation, a networking night sponsored by several major logistics firms and yacht brokers, the kind of event where connections were worth millions of dollars and reputations were built over quiet conversations near the railing. But right now the entire deck had turned into something else, an audience watching a situation that none of them fully understood. The hostess flipped another page on her clipboard as if the answer might appear if she looked hard enough, her voice tight with the confidence of someone who believed she was protecting the event. I told you already, your name is not here, sir. The list is very clear. And the security guard near the staircase took one step closer, not aggressive, just ready, because that was his job to respond. When the person running the guest list said someone did not belong, a man near the bar whispered to his friend, probably slipped in from the dock. Happens all the time during boat shows. Another guest shook his head quietly, amused by the unexpected interruption of the evening entertainment. But Darnell did not react to the comments. He simply watched the water for a moment, the slow rhythm of the waves tapping against the hull, the same sound he had grown up hearing as a kid standing near the shipping yards of Galveston, Texas, long before anyone called him Mr. Williams or asked for his business card, long before the articles in Forbes magazine or the interviews about how he built Williams Maritime Group into one of the fastest growing cargo logistics companies in North America. Back then, he was just a teenager watching giant container ships move across the horizon, wondering how something so massive could glide through the water with such quiet power. That memory still lived somewhere behind his calm expression now, because what most of the people on this yacht did not know was that the company he built now operated ports in 3 countries, managed cargo routes across the Gulf and the Atlantic, and recently secured a billion-dollar infrastructure partnership that had made headlines across the maritime industry. But none of that history was visible tonight. No designer watch, no security team, no introduction from an event coordinator, just a man standing on a yacht while a hostess insisted he did not belong. And that was exactly the test Darnell had wanted to run, because earlier that afternoon, when his assistant Angela reviewed the event briefing, she had mentioned something interesting. The organizers were celebrating their newest corporate sponsor, a maritime logistics partner whose funding had helped make this entire gathering possible, and that sponsor happened to be Williams Maritime Group. But the marketing materials had focused on the company name, not the man behind it. So when Darnell decided to attend, he chose not to announce himself. He wanted to see the event from the perspective of someone unknown, someone without a title printed next to his name. And now, standing under the string lights with 50 curious eyes watching, he was getting his answer. The hostess finally closed the clipboard with a small, impatient sigh and spoke again, this time loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Sir, I am asking you one more time, please step back toward the dock entrance. If you do not have an invitation, you cannot remain on this yacht. And the words hung in the night air while the skyline glittered across Biscayne Bay, and Darnell Williams slowly turned his gaze from the water back to the woman blocking his path, his expression still calm, still thoughtful, like a man measuring something far more important than a guest list. The air on the upper deck did not return to normal after the hostess finished speaking, because moments like this have a way of changing the energy of a room, even when nobody understands exactly why, and the music that had stopped minutes earlier had still not resumed, leaving the quiet murmur of the ocean and the distant buzz of Miami traffic as the only sounds drifting across the water, while the guests formed small circles of curiosity around the situation, like investors watching a negotiation unfold. Darnell Williams stood exactly where he had been a moment earlier, calm, steady, hands relaxed at his sides, while the hostess waited for him to respond, her posture rigid with the kind of confidence that comes from believing the rules are on your side. The security guard glanced between them, unsure whether he was about to escort someone out or simply stand there until the awkward moment dissolved. But the silence stretched long enough that several people began whispering openly. Now a tall man in a gray blazer leaned toward the woman beside him and said quietly, I mean, if he was invited, he would just say so, right? Another guest chuckled softly and replied, maybe he thinks this is a public cruise. Someone else near the rail lifted a phone, pretending to check a message, but clearly angling the camera toward the center of the deck, because unexpected drama always travels faster than ocean wind, and Darnell could feel the shift happening around him, the way people started forming opinions without asking questions, the way small assumptions hardened into quiet judgments. But he had experienced that exact shift many times before, and it no longer surprised him. The hostess finally took a small step closer, lowering her voice just enough to sound controlled, but still firm. Sir, I am trying to be polite, but we cannot delay the event because of a misunderstanding. If you arrived without an invitation, you simply need to return to the dock entrance. The marina staff can help you find the correct vessel. Her tone carried the polished patience of someone trained in luxury hospitality. But the meaning underneath it was unmistakable: "You do not belong here," and a few guests nodded subtly, as if the matter had already been decided. One of the bartenders paused while placing glasses on the counter, watching the exchange with growing curiosity, because something about the man in the linen shirt did not match the narrative forming around him. He did not look embarrassed, he did not look confused, he looked thoughtful, like someone observing an experiment unfold in real time. Another server leaned toward him and whispered, "Do you know him?" The bartender shook his head slowly, but kept watching because the man had not once tried to defend himself or explain why he was there, and that silence was beginning to feel deliberate. Across the deck, the man in the navy blazer laughed again, louder this time. "Well, if you are waiting for a speech, buddy, this is not a press conference." A few people nearby smiled politely, enjoying the moment in the same way people enjoy watching tension from a safe distance, but Darnell Williams simply shifted his weight slightly and looked across the glowing skyline. Beyond the rail, the lights of the port cranes blinking red in the distance, like quiet reminders of the industry that built half the wealth standing on this boat tonight. And for a brief moment, another memory passed through his mind, not the shipping yards this time, but a conference hall in Houston 12 years earlier, when he had pitched the first expansion of Williams Maritime Group to a room full of investors who stared at him with the same cautious doubt that hung in the air now. That meeting had ended very differently than they expected, and the company they hesitated to fund eventually became one of the fastest growing cargo networks along the Gulf Coast. But success has a strange way of remaining invisible until someone points directly at it. And tonight nobody on this yacht had made that connection, yet the hostess glanced again at her clipboard, as if determined to finish the situation before it became a spectacle. Her voice now sharper than before. "Sir, this is the final request. Please step toward the exit ramp. If you do not comply, security will escort you off the vessel." The words traveled across the deck, instantly drawing the attention of every nearby conversation, and the security guard finally moved too. Careful steps closer, not touching, not threatening, simply preparing to guide a guest away if the hostess asked for it. While phones tilted slightly higher and whispers grew louder, Darnell Williams slowly turned his head back toward the center of the yacht, his expression calm, almost reflective, as if measuring the weight of everything that had just been said. And in that quiet moment, the bartender at the far end of the bar leaned toward the small tablet used for the digital guest registry, scrolling through the sponsor list one more time, because a strange feeling had settled in his mind like a puzzle piece, almost fitting. And as the screen refreshed under the glow of the deck lights, he paused, staring at one particular name, while across the deck the hostess folded her arms, waiting for the man in the linen shirt to finally leave the yacht. He supposedly never should have boarded in the first place. The bartender did not realize he had stopped moving until another server beside him whispered quietly, "Hey, are you all right?" Because his eyes had frozen on the glowing tablet screen in front of him, where the event management system displayed the sponsor registry for the evening, a simple list meant only for staff coordination, but the name sitting near the top of that list had suddenly pulled his attention like a lighthouse in fog. He blinked once, thinking he had read it wrong, then scrolled up and down again, just to be sure, because the letters were unmistakable: Williams Maritime Group title sponsor, and directly beneath it in smaller text the contact name listed for the entire sponsorship agreement, Darnell Williams. The bartender slowly lifted his head, looking across the deck toward the man in the linen shirt, standing quietly while half the party watched him like an inconvenience, and the strange feeling he had earlier returned, stronger now, like a puzzle piece finally locking into place. Across the deck, the hostess still stood with her arms folded, her expression fixed with polite impatience, the kind that suggested the situation should have ended already. "Sir, I am not repeating myself again," she said, her voice clear enough that several nearby guests stopped their conversations entirely. "Please step toward the exit ramp." The security guard remained beside her, waiting for a signal, while the man in the navy blazer near the bar smirked again, shaking his head as if the entire scene confirmed what he already believed: someone should escort him before this turns into a bigger problem. Another guest chuckled quietly and added, "Yet the marina probably has the right boat for him somewhere else." A ripple of restrained laughter moved through the small crowd, but Darnell Williams did not react to the comments. He simply stood there, steady under the string lights, his gaze drifting slowly across the deck, the glowing skyline reflected in the calm water behind him, and the bartender, watching from the far side of the bar, suddenly felt something shift inside his chest. Not fear, not exactly, but a sharp awareness that the scene unfolding in front of him might be very different from what everyone else assumed. He leaned toward the other server again, lowering his voice. "I think that man is actually supposed to be here." The server frowned. "What? Do you mean?" The bartender turned the tablet slightly, so his co-worker could see the screen. "Williams Maritime Group is the title sponsor tonight. And look at the contact name listed for the sponsorship agreement." The server leaned closer, reading the line carefully before looking back across the deck toward the man standing calmly in the center of the attention. "Wait, are you saying that is him?" The bartender did not answer immediately, because even saying the thought out loud felt strange when the entire party had already decided the opposite. Across the deck, the hostess had begun tapping her clipboard again, clearly determined to finish the situation before it grew more uncomfortable. "Sir," she said again, this time with a sharper edge, "if you refuse to leave, we will have to involve marina security." The security guard shifted his stance slightly, preparing to guide the man back toward the dock, but before anyone moved, the bartender suddenly stepped out from behind the bar, wiping his hands on a white towel, as if gathering the courage to interrupt something that had already gained too much momentum. "Excuse me," he said cautiously, not loud enough to command the whole deck, but enough for the nearest guests to turn toward him. The hostess looked over her shoulder briefly, clearly irritated by the interruption. "Yes, what is it?" The bartender hesitated for half a second, glancing at the tablet still glowing behind him, then back toward the man in the linen shirt. "I might be mistaken," he said carefully, "but I think that name might actually be in the system." The hostess frowned immediately. "That is not possible. I checked the guest list twice tonight." The bartender nodded slowly, understanding her confidence, but still pointing toward the bar area. "We are not looking at the guest list," he said. "We are looking at the sponsor registry." And the quiet murmur across the deck grew slightly louder as people turned toward the bar, trying to understand what he meant. The man in the navy blazer scoffed dismissively. "Sponsors do not arrive dressed like that." The hostess barely glanced toward the tablet, clearly convinced the matter was already resolved. "Thank you, but the situation is under control," she said quickly before turning back toward Darnell Williams. "Sir, please proceed," toward the exit ramp. And for a moment, the bartender looked uncertain whether to speak again, because interrupting the hostess during a high-profile event was not something staff usually did lightly. But the name glowing on that screen would not disappear, and the calm expression on the man standing under the lights made the whole situation feel increasingly strange, like a story unfolding in the wrong order. Across the deck, Darnell Williams watched the exchange quietly, saying nothing yet, while the ocean breeze moved softly across the yacht and the skyline shimmered beyond the rail. Because sometimes the truth does not rush into a room. Sometimes it simply waits while everyone else finishes making their assumptions first. For a few seconds, the deck of the yacht felt suspended between two versions of reality, because the bartender's words had landed softly, but the meaning behind them carried a weight that had not yet fully reached the crowd. The hostess turned slowly toward the bar, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she had just heard something mildly inconvenient rather than potentially important. "That is not relevant," she said firmly. "The sponsor registry is handled by the event coordinators, not the guest list. And this man is not on the guest list." The bartender opened his mouth again, but hesitated because every guest nearby was now looking at him. And the last thing a bartender wants during a high-profile event is to become the center of attention. Yet the name glowing on the tablet behind him refused to leave his mind, and he glanced once more toward the screen before speaking carefully. "I understand, but the registry shows the name Darnell Williams as the primary contact for the sponsorship agreement." The moment the name left his mouth, the air shifted slightly, not dramatically, not yet, but enough that several guests exchanged curious looks, because even those who had never met the man knew the company Williams Maritime Group had been mentioned several times during the opening speeches earlier that evening. The man in the navy blazer frowned for the first time. "Wait, are you talking about the Williams Shipping Company?" The bartender nodded slowly. "That is the one." The hostess, however, reacted with immediate dismissal. "That cannot be correct," she said quickly, clearly irritated now, because the situation was slipping out of the neat conclusion she had already decided. "Sir," she continued, turning back toward Darnell Williams with renewed authority, "I do not know what misunderstanding is happening here, but this event is private and you are delaying the program. Please step toward the dock ramp." Now the security guard glanced between them, uncertain, because even he had heard the name Williams Maritime Group before. The company operated cargo routes along the Gulf Coast and Atlantic shipping corridors, and it was not exactly a small operation, but he remained where he stood, waiting for clear instructions from the Hostess, who still believed the matter was simple across the deck, a quiet whisper moved through the guests. The woman near the rail leaned toward her companion. Did he just say Darnell Williams? The man beside her shrugged. Maybe there are two people with that name. Someone else near the bar murmured. I thought the sponsor tonight was someone from Texas, but uncertainty had begun to creep into the confident smiles around the deck, and that small crack in the narrative widened another inch when the bartender added softly, I could be mistaken, but the system lists him as the direct sponsor contact, and a young server beside him nodded nervously, confirming what he had seen on the tablet. The hostess pressed her lips together, clearly frustrated, because what had started as a routine removal of an uninvited guest was now attracting far more attention than she wanted. Sir, she said again, louder this time, if you do not leave the yacht voluntarily, we will ask marina security to assist. And the security guard took a careful step forward, ready to guide the man back toward the entrance ramp. The ocean breeze drifted across the deck, carrying the faint sound of waves against the hull, while the skyline lights shimmered across Biscayne Bay. And for the first time since the confrontation began, Darnell Williams moved not away from the crowd, but slightly forward, just enough that the string lights overhead caught the calm expression on his face. He looked at the hostess for a long, quiet moment, the kind of pause that makes people around you hold their breath without realizing it. And then something flickered through his memory, not anger, not embarrassment, but a familiar recognition, because this was not the first time he had stood in a place built by the very industry he helped shape. While someone insisted he could not possibly belong there 22 years earlier, he had walked into a private marina in Galveston wearing a work shirt after a 12-hour shift at a shipping yard, hoping to ask about leasing a small cargo dock for a startup logistics idea. The manager had looked at him the same way the hostess was looking now, measuring him against an image of who success was supposed to look like, and the manager had said almost casually, I think you are in the wrong place, son. The words had stayed with him for years, not as a wound, but as fuel, because that same dock eventually became one of the first terminals Williams Maritime Group ever leased, and now, standing on a yacht funded by that same company, he recognized the moment unfolding again, like a familiar scene repeating itself across time. The difference tonight, however, was that the story was about to move in a direction nobody on this deck expected, because as the security guard prepared to escort him toward the ramp, Darnell Williams finally lifted his head slightly and opened his mouth to speak. For the first time since the confrontation began, Darnell Williams finally spoke. And when he did, his voice was calm, steady, and surprisingly quiet for a moment that had already pulled the attention of nearly everyone on the upper deck. I understand what you are doing, he said, looking directly at the hostess, and the words were not defensive or angry. They carried the tone of someone acknowledging a situation rather than fighting it. The security guard paused mid-step, unsure whether to continue escorting him or wait for the exchange to finish, because the man standing in front of him did not sound like someone arguing his way into a party. He sounded like someone carefully deciding what to reveal next. The hostess, however, interpreted the calm tone as hesitation. Good, then we are clear, she replied quickly, clearly eager to close the situation before the growing curiosity of the guests turned the entire deck into a spectacle. Please follow the guard to the ramp, and we can resolve any confusion with the marina staff on the dock. But Darnell did not move. Instead, he slowly reached into the pocket of his linen shirt, pulling out his phone, not in a dramatic gesture, not like someone trying to prove a point, but like a man making a routine call. He glanced briefly at the screen before placing the phone to his ear, and across the deck several guests exchanged puzzled looks, because the moment had taken an unexpected turn. The hostess frowned slightly. Sir, you cannot make calls in the middle of this situation, she said, but Darnell simply lifted one finger, gently signaling that he needed a moment, and when the call connected, his voice remained composed. Angela, he said quietly, it is Darnell. I believe we might need to verify something on the event registry tonight. The name Angela meant nothing to the crowd, but the woman on the other end of the line knew exactly who was speaking. Angela Carter had served as the executive operations director for Williams Maritime Group for nearly a decade, and her phone rarely rang without purpose. Is there an issue? She asked immediately, her voice calm but alert, standing under the soft glow of the yacht lights. Darnell glanced briefly toward the bar where the tablet Screens still displayed the sponsor registry, and then back at the hostess who was watching the call with growing impatience. "I was hoping you could confirm something," he said. "Does the sponsorship agreement for this event list Williams Maritime Group as the title sponsor?" There was a short pause on the line, not confusion, but the sound of someone already opening the relevant documents. "Yes, it does," Angela replied. Without hesitation, the agreement was finalized 3 weeks ago through the Miami Maritime Networking Council. Darnell nodded slightly, though she could not see him and the contact name listed for the sponsorship. He asked, "The primary contact is you," Angela answered. "Mr. Williams." The words traveled only a few inches from the phone, but somehow they seemed to ripple through the silence of the deck, because the bartender at the bar had already stepped a little closer, and the security guard standing beside Darnell could not help. Overhearing the conversation, the hostess folded her arms again, clearly losing patience. "Sir, if this is an attempt to stall the situation, it is not working," she said sharply. But Darnell simply continued speaking into the phone. "Angela, could you do me a favor?" he said. "Please open the event coordination email thread and confirm the name listed as the attending representative tonight." Another brief pause followed as the sounds of distant typing came faintly through the speaker, while the ocean breeze moved softly across the deck and the skyline shimmered behind them. Then Angela spoke again, this time with a hint of confusion in her voice. "The attending representative is you, Mr. Williams. You confirmed the RSVP personally yesterday morning." Several guests nearby turned their heads sharply toward Darnell at those words. The man in the navy blazer, who had been laughing earlier, suddenly stopped smiling entirely, while the bartender behind the bar stared openly now, because the pieces of the puzzle he had been noticing all evening were beginning to fall into place. But the hostess shook her head, dismissively refusing to accept what she was hearing. "That proves nothing," she said quickly. "Anyone can say a name over the phone." The situation, however, had already begun to shift in subtle ways, because uncertainty had replaced the earlier confidence that the man standing in front of them was simply an uninvited guest, and the security guard who had been preparing to escort him away now stood completely still, unsure whether he was about to remove the wrong person from the very event he was hired to protect. Darnell Williams lowered the phone slightly, but did not hang up. "Angela," he said calmly, "one more question. Please confirm the total value of the sponsorship agreement for tonight." Angela answered immediately, $3 million, Mr. Williams, including event production support and maritime innovation grants. The number hung in the warm night air like a sudden change in gravity, because $3 million was not the kind of contribution that arrived anonymously at a private yacht event. And for the first time since the confrontation began, the hostess looked directly at the man in the linen shirt with something that no longer resembled certainty. Darnell Williams lowered the phone slowly after Angela finished speaking, and for a moment the only sound on the deck was the soft movement of water against the hull and the distant hum of traffic drifting from the Miami shoreline, because the number $3 million had landed heavier than anyone expected. The hostess did not respond immediately, her confident posture tightening slightly, as if the entire situation had slipped a few inches outside the script she had written in her mind earlier that evening. The security guard beside Darnell cleared his throat, quietly unsure whether he was still supposed to guide the man toward the exit or remain exactly where he stood, because the conversation he had just overheard did not sound like the story of an uninvited guest anymore. Several guests exchanged long, uncertain looks. The man in the navy blazer, who had been laughing earlier, now stared directly at Darnell, trying to measure the calm figure standing under the lights against the name he had just heard repeated on the phone, and the pieces began to shift slowly inside his mind. "Williams Maritime Group," he murmured almost to himself. The bartender at the far side of the bar nodded quietly, because the sponsor registry on the tablet had not changed. The name was still there, glowing clearly on the screen, while the hostess attempted to regain control of the moment. "Sir," she said, carefully choosing each word now, "this event receives sponsorship from many companies that does not automatically grant access without proper guest registration." The sentence sounded polished and professional, but the firmness in her voice had begun to crack slightly, because uncertainty had replaced the certainty she carried minutes earlier. Darnell watched her calmly, without anger, without embarrassment, the way a captain watches the tide before deciding when to move a ship through a narrow channel. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and spoke again for the first time since the call ended. "I understand procedures," he said quietly. "I run a company that depends on them every day." The words were simple, but the tone behind them carried a weight that several people around the deck felt instantly. Because this was no longer a man trying to defend his presence, this was someone explaining something from a position far more stable than the argument happening around him. The hostess looked down briefly at the clipboard in her hands, as if hoping the guest list might somehow resolve the confusion, but the list did not change, and the name she had been searching for was still not there. The bartender finally stepped forward a little closer, holding the tablet carefully. "Excuse me," he said again, this time louder, so that more of the surrounding guests could hear. "I think we should double-check the sponsor registry." The hostess turned toward him with visible frustration. "I already told you the guest list is final." But the bartender lifted the tablet, slightly showing the glowing screen to the security guard and to anyone nearby who cared to look. The registry lists Darnell Williams as the attending representative for Williams Maritime Group. He said. The words moved through the crowd like a ripple through still water. Several guests leaned closer, reading the screen, while quiet murmurs replaced the earlier laughter, because the name was no longer just something spoken over a phone call. It was now visible inside the event system itself. The man in the navy blazer stepped forward. Squinting at the tablet. "Wait a second," he said slowly. "I read an article about him last year. The shipping executive from Texas, the one expanding port operations along the Gulf Coast." The bartender nodded once, and suddenly the man looked back toward Darnell with an entirely different expression, because the calm figure standing in the linen shirt now carried a history the crowd had simply failed to recognize earlier. The hostess, however, remained frozen between two possibilities: the one she had believed from the beginning, and the one forming rapidly around her now. Darnell watched the confusion unfold quietly before speaking again, his voice still steady, still controlled. "You said earlier that this event was private." He said. "That is correct," she replied automatically. He nodded once. "That is precisely why my company agreed to sponsor it." The sentence landed with a quiet finality that silenced nearly every conversation on the deck, because the meaning behind it required no explanation. The skyline lights shimmered across the water, and the string lights above the deck reflected softly in the polished railings while the hostess stared at the man she had been trying to remove from the yacht. The security guard shifted his weight again, clearly realizing that the situation he thought he understood 15 minutes earlier had changed entirely, and across the deck more guests began pulling out their phones, searching the name they had just heard spoken out loud, and one by one the same realization began appearing across their faces, because the man standing calmly in front of them was not someone who had wandered into the wrong event. He was the reason the event existed at all. The realization did not arrive all at once, but it spread slowly across the deck, like a tide rolling under the hull of the yacht. Quiet at first, then impossible to ignore, because once the name appeared on the screen, and once a few guests began searching it on their phones, the story that had been forming in everyone's minds began to collapse piece by piece. The man in the navy blazer looked down at his phone again, scrolling quickly before lifting his eyes back toward Darnell Williams with a completely different expression. "That is him," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "Williams Maritime Group, the logistics company expanding across the Gulf and Atlantic ports." The bartender behind the bar nodded slowly, as if the final confirmation had just settled into place, while several guests nearby leaned closer, trying to see the screen of the tablet again, because the sponsor registry still showed the same glowing line, Darnell Williams, primary contact title sponsor. The hostess stood very still for a moment, the clipboard still in her hands, but now it looked less like a tool of authority and more like a reminder of how certain she had been earlier that evening. Her voice, when she finally spoke, sounded smaller than before, almost cautious. "I was not informed that the sponsor representative would arrive without prior check-in," she said, as if the explanation might somehow soften the moment. But Darnell Williams did not react with anger. He simply looked around the deck, observing the subtle transformation happening around him. The guests who had been whispering earlier now watched him with quiet curiosity. The security guard who had been ready to escort him away had stepped back half a pace, unconsciously giving space to the man he had nearly removed from the event, and even the bartender who had first noticed the name seemed unsure whether to return behind the counter or remain where he stood. The entire deck had shifted from suspicion to something closer to respect, and uncertainty mixed together like a sudden change in wind direction across the bay. The skyline lights shimmered across the water, and the yacht rocked gently in the calm evening tide while the hostess cleared her throat, attempting to recover the authority she carried earlier, Mr. Williams," she said slowly, now addressing him by name for the first time. "If there has been a misunderstanding regarding your arrival, I can contact the event coordinator immediately to confirm the sponsorship records." Darnell nodded. "Once that would probably be helpful," he said quietly, because the purpose of the call he had made earlier was never to embarrass anyone. It was simply to let the truth reach the room in its own time, and now that truth was arriving from several directions at once, because one of the younger guests near the rail suddenly spoke up. "I just looked him up," she said, holding her phone slightly higher. "That is definitely him. The article says his company funded the Maritime Innovation Grants announced tonight." Another guest added, "I remember reading about the port expansion project last month. That was Williams Maritime Group, too." The murmurs across the deck grew louder, but the tone had changed completely. The same crowd that had watched him as an outsider minutes earlier now studied him with the quiet fascination people reserve for someone whose influence extends far beyond the room they are standing in. The security guard shifted his stance again, looking briefly at the hostess, waiting for new instructions, but none came immediately because the situation had already resolved itself without anyone raising their voice. The bartender finally returned behind the bar, slowly placing the tablet back on the counter, though the glowing sponsor registry remained visible to anyone who walked past, and the man in the navy blazer, who had laughed earlier, now approached Darnell with an awkward smile. "I believe we may have misread the situation," he admitted carefully, but Darnell simply nodded politely, because the truth was he had not come to the yacht expecting recognition. He had come to observe something far more valuable: the way people treat a stranger before they know who that stranger really is. Across the deck, the hostess finally lowered the clipboard entirely and looked directly at him, her voice noticeably softer. "Mr. Williams, the first, sincerely apologize for the confusion earlier," she said. "This evening has several moving parts, and I did not realize the sponsor representative had already arrived." But the calm expression on Darnell Williams did not change, because the moment was never about apologies or embarrassment. It was about something much simpler, something that had quietly revealed itself to everyone on the yacht tonight: the difference between appearance and reality. And as the music slowly began playing again through the speakers, and the conversations around the deck cautiously resumed, one undeniable fact now hung in the air above the water: the man who had nearly been escorted off the yacht was the very reason the yacht party existed at all. The music on the yacht returned slowly, not with the lively energy that had filled the deck earlier, but with a cautious rhythm, as if even the speakers understood that something important had just happened. Conversations resumed in quiet fragments, while the ocean breeze carried the soft notes across the water, and the skyline of Miami shimmered in the distance, but the center of attention on the upper deck had not shifted away from Darnell Williams. Guests who only minutes earlier had watched him with suspicion now approached carefully, some offering polite greetings, others simply observing the calm man whose name they had just searched on their phones. The man in the navy blazer cleared his throat again, attempting a more respectful introduction. "Mr. Williams, the first owe you an apology," he said sincerely. "I spoke earlier without understanding who you were." Darnell nodded, once acknowledging the statement without making the moment uncomfortable, because the truth was the apology itself was not the most important part of what had just happened. The hostess still stood a few steps away, holding the clipboard loosely at her side. The confident posture she carried earlier had softened into something closer to humility. "Mr. Williams," she said quietly, "I truly am sorry for the misunderstanding tonight. Our team relies heavily on the guest list, and when your name did not appear there, I assumed you were not part of the event." Darnell listened patiently before answering, his voice calm and measured. "I understand procedures," he said again. "They exist for a reason, but the most important part of any procedure is remembering that people deserve respect before their titles are known." The words were not spoken as a reprimand, and not as a lecture. They were delivered like a simple observation, yet the effect was powerful, because everyone standing nearby understood the deeper meaning behind them. The bartender, who had first noticed the sponsor registry, smiled quietly behind the counter, realizing that the tension which had dominated the evening was now dissolving into something more reflective. The security guard straightened his jacket, slightly relieved that the moment had resolved without conflict, and several guests who had recorded the earlier confrontation lowered their phones, recognizing that the story had reached its true conclusion. The hostess nodded slowly, absorbing the message. "I will remember that," she said, Sincerely, Darnell looked across the deck at the group of investors, entrepreneurs, and maritime leaders who had gathered for the celebration tonight. The event itself was meant to highlight innovation in shipping logistics, sustainable port development, and the future of maritime trade. Yet the most important lesson of the evening had arrived. Before any keynote speech or formal presentation, he stepped toward the railing, briefly resting his hands on the polished surface while the lights of cargo ships blinked faintly in the distance. Those ships carried millions of tons of goods across oceans every year, guided by people whose names most of the world would never know, and that thought always reminded him why he built his company in the first place, not for recognition, but for progress. After a moment, he turned back toward the guests gathered around him. Tonight was supposed to celebrate the future of maritime innovation, he said calmly, and that future depends on something very simple: people working together with respect. The crowd listened quietly because the words carried a sincerity that did not require applause. I did not come here tonight to make a scene, he continued. I came here to see the industry moving forward, and I believe it still can. The man in the navy blazer nodded thoughtfully. Several other guests murmured their agreement, and the hostess finally allowed herself a small, relieved smile. As the tension fully disappeared, the bartender raised a glass from behind the counter, offering it toward Darnell in silent appreciation. While the music gradually grew louder again and conversations resumed with renewed energy, the yacht drifted gently against the calm water of Biscayne Bay, the skyline glowing behind it. And as the evening continued, one quiet understanding remained in the minds of everyone who had witnessed the moment earlier. The most powerful people in the room are not always the ones who arrive with the loudest introductions. Sometimes they are the ones who walk and quietly observe everything and remind everyone else that dignity should never depend on recognition.